So, Cuphead, am I right? I've brought it up before in my videos, but man, I love this game. Easily up there as one of my favorites. And that was all before this year. With the recent release of the game's long-awaited delicious last course, there's even more to love about this game than there already was. And that's just crazy to me. In fact, the delicious last course being as great as it was, is what motivated me to make some kind of Cuphead related video. Though admittedly, I wasn't quite feeling like doing a review of the game. So then I thought, hey, I do boss battle countdowns a lot, why not go that route? With how boss-centric Cuphead is, there's certainly a lot to talk about with a Cuphead bosses video. I mean heck, with the delicious last course, there's now a total of 31 bosses in this game, many of which being solid fights. So why not? Let's count down my favorites. Whether that be from their challenge factor, their creativity from a gameplay standpoint, or their creativity from a visual standpoint. Lots can factor into why I like the ones I like, as you'll soon see. One quick warning though before we begin. Given this list does include bosses from the delicious last course, which still is relatively new, I'm just gonna slap on a spoiler warning for the entire video. I know some are particular about going in blind to these kind of games, so I felt a warning would be fair to make. A brawl is surely brewing at this rate though, so with that said, here goes. Sorry, couldn't resist. So I will admit, while I do love Cuphead a lot, one aspect of it that I'm not the biggest fan of is the run and gun levels. I don't know, I never really found them all that fun, especially the ones closer to the end of the game. And leading up to the delicious last course's release, I did wonder if they were planning on including new run and gun levels with it. Fortunately though, the devs at Studio MDHR decided to provide a different means to get coins on the DLC island, and a much more fun means if you ask me. Enter the King's Leap, a floating castle containing 5 bosses themed around chess pieces, with each one defeated earning you coins. The catch with these fights, though, is that you have access to none of your weapons or charms. The only way you're damaging these bosses is through parrying. Already, I really like this idea, and while these fights are relatively short and simple, they each find unique ways to utilize the parry system to make each one stand out from one another. And out of all of them, my favorite was the Rook. Being the royal executioner, the Rook spends the fight sharpening his axe, releasing sparks from the grinder as projectiles. However, he also releases heads your way, some skulls, but more importantly, some being pink heads. For those unaware, anything in the game that's this vibrant pink is parryable, which means, yes, you parry the decapitated heads back at the Rook to do damage to him. For you longtime viewers, it's basically that one tree decorating minigame from the Rudolph Wii game, just without motion controls, and with a lot more Marie Antoinette. Like the other chess bosses, the Rook's fight is relatively short and simple, but not only did I find this one the most fun out of them, I kinda just love the absurdity of using decapitated heads as weapons against an executioner. Which sounds a lot more morbid than it actually is in this context. Kinda dark, yeah, but also kinda hilarious and definitely creative. All on top of a fight that's short but sweet. Maybe a bit weird for me to be putting this above several full-on boss fights, but opinions be like that sometimes. So next up, we've got the first of several plane-based boss fights on this list. Can't say I know what the general consensus on this gameplay style is, but, as evident by me saying there's several of these fights on this list, I like them. Granted, not all of them are gold. Yes, I'm looking at you, Dr. Call's robot. But there's definitely more great ones than bad in my opinion. And funny that I specifically use the term great, because to start off this collection of fights, we've got Jimmy the Great. First thing of note with this fight is the visual aspect. This isn't the only boss in the game to do this, but even still, I really like the rotating 3D sculpture in the background. It's very reminiscent of when animation in the 30s used 3D sculptures for their environments. So it fits pretty perfectly in a game like this, and it looks really great. And yes, they did actually make a 3D sculpture in Cuphead's case. Though as for the fight itself, being a genie, Jimmy's a pretty crafty opponent, using his phenomenal cosmic powers to the fullest all throughout. From transforming into multiple pillars for you to fly through, to using his sarcophagus full of mummy ghosts, to even creating a puppet clone of your character for you to fight. Variety is a very notable aspect of this boss. That chest of his from the start of the battle isn't even guaranteed to release the same attack on every run, so you gotta keep on your toes throughout. Wait, actually, what would the plane flying equivalent to that metaphor be? Point is, Jimmy's got a lot of tricks up his sleeves, which is impressive given how short his sleeves are. And it all culminates in his final phase of sending out energy rings, while one-eyed pyramids shoot out dark energy of their own. Also, I am resisting the urge to make a Bill Cipher joke regarding those pyramids. But yeah, this fight's got a lot going on in it, so at no point does it even start to feel stale. There's always something interesting happening, while never feeling like it's too much. Can't say the same about you, Dr. Call. Also, fun fact, Jimmy's one of a handful of bosses with a secret phase. If you're in the shrunken plane form when he starts the puppet phase, he'll instead skip it altogether and add a miniature puppet to the final phase. I just find that attention to detail kinda neat. I've previously talked in videos about the idea of how, sometimes, something being as good as it is all in the execution. Even a very simple idea can turn out incredible just based on how it's handled. And this can apply to several bosses in Cuphead. And one of my favorites in that regard is Sally's stage play. As a concept, her fight is quite simple. She's doing a stage show, with each phase of the fight being a different scene from the performance. But the way it's all executed is just so brilliantly done that I can't help but love it. The first phase has you fighting her in the middle of her wedding, and she'll use a variety of attacks, from kiss-based projectiles to dive kicks to teleportation, to stop you from crashing her wedding. The second phase takes you to her family life, not only fighting her and her added array of projectiles, but now her baby's throwing stuff from the windows. And all this is great as is, but then the third phase comes in and okay, she's a JRPG final boss now. No, seriously, not only does she have an evil angel-like form, but her animations are deliberately minimal, very reminiscent of enemy and boss sprites from the 2D Final Fantasy games, and there's even attack titles that show up on screen before each attack. Side note, I love the detail that this form isn't actually Sally the actress, but instead a cardboard prop being controlled by the offstage crew. That's just amazing. And it all culminates in the final phase being a curtain call. The way this fight utilizes the theme of a stage show is just so creative, and while it is one of the easier bosses of this portion of the game, it's one that I really enjoy coming back to. Though interestingly, this fight's also got a secret phase, and one that goes a pretty dark direction. During the first phase, if you parry off Sally's kiss attacks and land on these hanging platforms, you can cause the chandelier in the back to drop and kill her groom! This turns the second phase into Sally's life at a nunnery instead of a family life, and during the third phase, a JRPG boss version of her fallen groom joins her, adding an extra attack that doesn't follow the attack title pattern. It's what you deserve for killing her groom during their wedding. So you know that game trope where, as you're approaching a game's final boss, it first has you refight a bunch of bosses you fought earlier in the game, usually both to show how much stronger you've gotten since you first fought these bosses, but also to help pad out the game a bit? Yeah, this trope can be a bit of a mixed bag, especially if the game doesn't do anything particularly creative with it. If it's just a straightforward boss rush, it'll often feel like a waste of time. Well, Cuphead does do a boss rush of sorts, but it finds a very different way to tackle the trope, and anyone who's played the game knows exactly where we're going with this, so with that said, let's talk about Mr. King Dice himself. Being the man who roadblocks you at the end of each world until you've beaten all the currently available bosses, you cross paths with this charismatic crony a fair bit, all while being treated to his earworm of a theme song. So it only seemed fair that you'd fight him before taking on the devil. And sure enough, because your success in getting all the soul contracts made King Dice lose a bet, he faces you before you can go see his boss. And what a creative spin this fight takes. Before you fight King Dice directly, he has you play a makeshift board game, with your roles determining which of his own goons you end up fighting. So yeah, it's a boss rush, but one, you don't have to fight every single boss depending on your roles, at the very least you have to fight 3, and 2, every one of these bosses are brand new, rather than recycling fights from earlier in the game. Those factors alone make this feel very refreshing as a boss rush, but it helps that many of these bosses are pretty fun. Each of them also cleverly tie into the theme of the casino environment, whether that be a pile of chips that separates his body Yellow Devil style, a roulette table ballerina, a two-faced domino, just to name a few. And each of these feel distinct from one another. Heck, there's even some new plane-based battles among these ranks, the second of which having you play a game of memory in order to damage the freaky monkey toy. Now granted, King Dice only has one attack once you get to fighting him directly, but given the gauntlet beforehand, I think that's fair. It all comes together to make a fight that can end up pretty long depending on your dice rolls, but it's definitely a very standout boss, both within Cuphead and among other boss rushes. You ever have that moment in a game, usually early on in it, where once you've gone through it, you know for a fact that you're gonna love the game that you're playing? Well, that happened with me when first playing Cuphead. I had gone through the first couple bosses and the first run and gun level, and I was enjoying my time so far. The gameplay was fun, the visuals were great, I wasn't in love with the game just yet, but good times were being had. And then I got to Hildeberg. For starters, it was the game's first plane-based boss fight, so already it was throwing a nice surprise my way, and it helped that Hildeberg was leaving a great first impression for this style of gameplay. With her goofy but fun design, her unique transformations into Zodiac-based forms that each provided different challenges to avoid, once again, good times were being had. Her fight was also the right kind of difficulty for this early on. Challenging, but not impossible. But then I got to the final phase, and this happened. That right there, that was the specific moment for me. Even watching it now, that transition is just so smooth. And then she extends her face, revealing all these inner mechanisms, and then UFOs start flying by and shooting lasers and just woof! This fight goes completely nuts in its final phase, and this moment here was when I realized just how much I was gonna love Cuphead. And don't get me wrong, the boss fight itself is still very fun and can be pretty challenging, but I'll be perfectly honest, the visual aspect is largely why I love this fight as much as I do. And if stuff like this was occurring this early on in the game, you could bet I was very excited to see what the rest of the game had to offer. Well, we've had our focus on bosses from the base game for quite a bit of this list now, so how's about we take a look at some of what the delicious last course had to offer. The DLC's main bosses were honestly kinda nuts in how much grander they often felt compared to the base game's bosses, and many of those were already pretty grand. And if you want a good example of just how nuts the DLC can get, look no further than Esther Winchester. Being the only plane-based boss in the DLC, and coincidentally, my new favorite of the plane-based bosses, Esther Winchester is a fittingly wild ride for a fight in the Wild West. Right from the get-go, she's bombarding you with shots from her snake oil pistols, pulling cacti to take up a good chunk of the screen, all the while vultures are dropping sticks of dynamite, and literal horseflies are spitting out spiky projectiles your way. This first phase alone has a lot going on, giving you a nice taste of just how hectic things are gonna get. Things progress pretty naturally from there, with Esther now on foot and using her vacuum to suck up valuables and shoot them back out as projectiles. Though of course, if I've learned anything from Cuphead bosses, including some that have been on this list before, sometimes it's when things feel most natural that the curveballs are thrown. But even with that in mind, I couldn't have predicted this. Did that just happen? Esther's now a living pile of sausage links, running on all fours and flying while spitting out steaks. All the while you've also got to avoid hovering cans of beans. I'm sorry, who at Studio MDHR came up with this? And just when you think that's crazy enough as is, the final phase has her turning into a tin can of hot dogs, now having you avoid 2 chains of sausages, while the Esther on the front of the tin spits out jalapenos. As you can tell, there is a lot going on in this fight basically at every point. And while it may feel like a lot initially, I find it a lot more enjoyably chaotic than something like, well, you know what already. Also, I want to highlight the music of this fight. Now granted, the music in this game as a whole is fantastic, but this fight in particular, it really stood out to me. It captures that hectic nature of the fight perfectly, all while brilliantly mixing together Cuphead's big band music style with that Old West feel. The delicious last course got more experimental with its music, as I'll go over again later on, and this is a prime example of that. And all that on top of an incredibly fun and incredibly bonkers boss fight. As I said in the previous segment, the Delicious Last Course's main bosses went kinda nuts with how much grander they were. And while Esther Winchester was a great example of this from a visual standpoint, a couple of the bosses go that extra mile to be grander from a gameplay standpoint. A great example of this? The fight against the Howling Aces. So literally right from the get-go with this fight, you've got a really exciting concept for a Cuphead boss. You spent several bosses flying a plane, but now we've got a fight where you're on a plane, taking on a team of canine pilots in an airborne showdown, or, if I may, a literal dogfight. The first phase has you take on the bulldog of the team, shooting out crossbones from his shoulder and shooting out yarn balls from a weaponized tomcat, or, if I may, a Tommy gun. All the while, you're also dodging tennis balls thrown by the puppies in the bulldog's plane. Those puppies puppies being your target once the bulldog's out of the picture. This second phase is relatively simple, having you attack the 4 puppies while they fly about and bark letter projectiles. Side note, the letters they spit out spell out bow wow, which I think is kind of adorable. But where this fight gets insane from a gameplay standpoint is in its final phase. The team leader's aircraft takes a hold of the screen, bombarding you with laser beam fire before flipping the entire screen, while the team leader shoots out dog bowl projectiles. And when that's over, the screen flips yet again as the laser fire returns. The first time I got to this fight, this part caught me so off guard that I basically panicked and died immediately. But as I got used to how these parts worked, I grew to really love this. It's such a simple way to change up the gameplay, but it works so effectively. And for those wondering how the controls work during the screen flipping, the game actually lets you set how you want the controls to work in relation to the current way the camera's facing, which was a fantastic call. Though even beyond the screen flipping, this fight's got a wonderful sense of spectacle and scale, especially with the animation on the leader's aircraft. Seriously, this was so well done. Also, I know this game's already had plenty of Street Fighter references beforehand, but man, MDHR is not even being subtle anymore. The team leader's look is clearly inspired by Cammy, and the bulldog is just straight up Relento. Even down to the posing, like, this bulldog is absolutely Relento. Not that I'm complaining though, it's a good look for these bosses. And now, for the curveball. I imagine many of you recall that only a few months ago, I called the Phantom Express not only my favorite Cuphead boss, but one of my favorite bosses in games as a whole. Well, as weird as it is to say after only a few months, things do change. And as you might have guessed already, that change was that the DLC came out. What doesn't change though, is how fantastic this fight is. Man, I love cheeky segues. So first and foremost, I love the theming of this battle. Having you fight a ghost train, with each phase giving you a different ghoul to take on before battling the train's engine itself, is such a great idea. It allows the fight to constantly feel fresh as each phase, while thematically connected, feels so different from one another on a gameplay standpoint, and I really like that. And that's all great enough as is, but then there's also your platform that moves along with the train, with the ability to change its position on the screen by parrying the vaults on the end of them, allowing you to strategize your position at any given moment. But then you've also got extra enemies dropping projectiles that can also set off the vaults, giving you another factor to keep in mind throughout the fight. It adds a simple but effective hecticness to it, as you're focusing on attacking the boss and dodging its attacks, all the while needing to keep an eye on those projectiles, and deciding if you try to stop them or let them move your platform. It all makes for a really memorable battle, accompanied with the jazz band brilliantly mimicking the sound of a train throughout the boss theme, which really adds nicely to the fight. But yeah, while it's not my favorite Cuphead boss anymore, the Phantom Express is still a super solid fight. And to think, Cuphead didn't even need to resort to a Phoenix Down or suplexing to take down the spooky train. There, I made a Phantom Train reference this time. You're welcome. So remember what I said earlier in the video about specific moments that make you realize how much you're gonna love a game, and how the final phase of the Hildeberg fight was that moment when I first played Cuphead? Well, funny enough, I had one of those types of moments again when first playing the delicious last course. The first boss I had gone after when starting the DLC was Glumstone the Giant, and that was a pretty good fight. Took a bit of getting used to some of his attacks, but he felt on par with many of Cuphead's stronger bosses. Good first impression. And then to follow that up, I fought the Moonshine Mob. While Glumstone was about the quality I was expecting, the Moonshine Mob went far beyond my expectations, and ended up being that specific moment for me with the DLC. Like, man, this fight's fantastic. For starters, the setup of the battle is brilliant. Instead of it being the usual you versus the boss dynamic, the fight actually starts as a feud between the titular Moonshine Mob and the police trying to thwart them, with you being in the middle of their conflict. The police enemies even shoot the projectiles in the direction of the boss rather than you during the first phase. And I think this is such a cool idea. And that's all before mentioning the fight itself. Like with the Howling Aces and the Phantom Express, each phase has you dealing with a different opponent. The first phase has you fighting a spider mobster, who walks around the 3 lanes calling up goons to join the fight, dropping in webbed bombs, and kicking in caterpillar mobsters as projectiles. All the while, the previously mentioned police enemies are shooting their shots at the spider mobster. And already this fight's overall dynamic feels so unique to the other bosses of the game. But that's only the first phase, and it's followed up by the arrival of a dancing light bug, with her gramophone shooting out sound waves that gradually turn red, becoming hazards when in said state. All the while clearing out more police enemies and dancing barrels. As you do. And once this light bug's defeated, in comes a giant anteater under the mob leader's command, who uses his snout to poke out from the side of the arena and eventually grab a bunch of bugs with his long tongue to use as a projectile. With the way that he sometimes fakes out his tongue use and with a small window to do damage, this phase in particular can get quite tricky, and many of my runs ended at this phase, but it's a really fun challenge regardless. Though on top of all this, what makes this fight extra special for me is the little details and Easter eggs tied to it. In the former's case, the battle begins with the mob leader playing the part of battle announcer, rather than the usual one.
Good time for a swell battle.
And he does the same for the knockout. Except his knockout is actually a fake out, and he starts attacking you himself even once the anteater's down. It's such a sneaky little trick that fits a sleazy mob boss, and I love it. But then there's the matter of the Easter eggs related to this fight. As was discovered after the base game came out, there was a handful of bosses that were previously planned for the game that got cut at various stages of development. Two of the more famous cut bosses among the community were this giant gentleman spider boss and a boss simply known as the Light, whose concept image showed spinning waves of light coating the stage as an attack. Oh, but wait, a well-dressed spider? A boss that attacks with spinning energy waves? Yep! These concepts were both revived for the Moonshine mob fight. I find it great when developers are able to take scrapped content and find a way to reincorporate it into the game at a later time. And the way these scrapped bosses were added into the delicious last course was so well done. The Moonshine mob fight is so full of charm and creativity, all while being a continuously engaging battle. And it's absolutely something special. With the devil out of commission following his defeat at the end of the main game, the delicious last course has you going on a very different kind of quest. In particular, your friend Miss Chalice is wanting to return to a living form, and the talented Chef Saltbaker has just the recipe to do so. However, to make this recipe, an all-powerful Wonder Tart, you need very special ingredients, which each of the bosses you fight hold. So you fight each of the bosses, gather up the ingredients, and head back to Chef Saltbaker's bakery and... Oh. Yeah, as it turns out, the Jolly Chef isn't quite the man he presented himself as at the start, and has been plotting to make the Wonder Tart not to restore Miss Chalice, but to take control over the astral plane that she resides in. On top of that, whichever your party's currently in soul form has been snatched up as the final secret ingredient for the Wonder Tart, and with those stakes set, you face off against the Mad Baker. And boy, what a fight it is! The final battle against Chef Saltbaker is such a spectacle of a showdown that it's hard to even describe where exactly to start. Well, actually, how about we start with the nature of his attacks in the first phase? Quite cleverly, all of Saltbaker's attacks at the start are based around the various ingredients you've collected throughout the DLC. Except, as revealed during this part, each of these ingredients are sentient, and Saltbaker is merciless to them! But you can't let his torturous methods in the background distract you, because he's gonna bombard you with these attacks. And if you're not keeping attention on what's flying your way, you're gonna lose health fast. But once you've done enough damage, Saltbaker eats up a mushroom, grows to gargantuan size, I see what you did there, MDHR, and summons a bunch of sentient pepper shakers to attack you. This time you're not attacking Saltbaker directly, but attacking the pepper shakers until they launch off and hit Saltbaker. But even with less going on in the background this time, you gotta remain on your toes at all times, because there's a lot you've gotta keep an eye out for. But once he's been damaged enough, the chef's body shatters, which only opens the floor for things to get creepier. After a brief phase against these two dancing salt clones of the chef, Saltbaker terraforms the environment, trapping you between two tornadoes of pure nightmare fuel as his very heart begins to fly around to kill you. It's only once this heart's been damaged enough that the fight comes to an end. But my goodness, what a ride it is to even get there. The Chef Saltbaker fight is so utterly insane and creepy and incredibly difficult, but man, I loved every single second of it. Even the chef himself is such a highlight, with a crazed look that feels like something you'd see out of an old school Disney villain. Heck, his evil smile and crazed eyes in the second phase aren't far off from that creepy coachman from Disney's Pinocchio. Seriously, look at these side by side. And I haven't even mentioned the boss theme yet. Mixing big band music with Old West style music was impressive enough, but somehow, they combined jazz band with the kind of music you'd hear in an RPG final boss, and they made it work flawlessly. This fight may have kicked me to the curb a fair bit when I first played the delicious last course, but if it wasn't apparent yet, I loved Chef Saltbaker's boss battle. Heck, I loved it so much that I went out of my way to go for the S rank on it, something I didn't even bother trying for with the other bosses. And sure, it took me over an hour's worth of attempts to do so, because my goodness, this fight gets even crazier on expert difficulty, but hey, I managed to pull it off. Also, one last thing. Can we just acknowledge that the final boss of the delicious last course, the end of a game known for being incredibly hard, is a man made of salt? And with that, I'm done with gushing about Cuphead for today. If you haven't taken the opportunity to play this wonderful game yet, I highly recommend doing so. Unless you know it's the kind of game you wouldn't enjoy, in which case, don't force yourself. But anyway, I first wanted to thank the brilliant people at Studio MDHR for making this game and its DLC, and doing a fantastic job with it all. Maybe don't remortgage your houses next time though. But also, I want to thank all of you for watching this video of mine. I really appreciate it. With all that said, this has been BenjaMage, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.